Hello, everyone, and welcome to American History 1301. This is our first presentation in the series, and it covers the time from 1490's into the 1550's, the Age of Discovery. In this presentation, we're going to start by talking about pre-Columbian America, and we'll have a lot of slides on that. Then we'll talk about the Age of Discovery. First, we'll begin with Spanish colonialism. We'll trace all the major elements of that, and we'll talk about myth versus reality. The motives that the Spanish used in their interaction with the Native Americans includes trade's increase, spread the word of God, and plundering glory. As you can see, your readings are from chapter 1 through 3 in the textbook. So, as a piece of sort of housekeeping, if you're in my classes and you're watching this because of my classes, you'll see that I always start in with a lead-in slide. Then I'll transition and get into the topic at hand. My topics are always very, very image heavy, and you'll see that as we go through this. So as you watch this, please, and I cannot emphasize this enough, please take good notes. Treat this just as if you were in the actual classroom. Take good notes on this. Do not depend upon the idea that you can go back and watch all the slides again in preparation for a test. That's not going to work. These presentations go on for hours. Another thing that I'm always going to wind up doing is starting with a thesis statement. So our thesis statement on pre-Columbian America, it's not on this slide, it's not going to be on the next slide, it's all image heavy. But our thesis statement is Native Americans contained everything within their society except an easily transmittable form of writing. Now again, as a piece of housekeeping, when I present you with a thesis statement like that, the next step is to give you a whole lot of evidence, build a case. In other words, it serves no purpose to give you a thesis statement and then just talk about the topic at hand. The setting of the information that I'm giving you is to support the thesis statement. So again, as we go through this, I'll go through the Age of Discovery, Spanish colonialism, and there will be another thesis statement dealing with how the Europeans interacted with the Native Americans. And then we'll go on to later on down the line, we'll get through with the French, and then we'll talk about the English. All right, with that in mind, let's start talking about pre-Columbian Native America. They had everything that we associate with civilization except an easily transmittable form of writing. So let's take a careful look at this slide. The topic matter at hand is Mesoamerica in Central, and then later on a little bit on South America. And in this course, you'll be doing a lot of image analysis. So let's slow down just a minute and kind of take a look at what I'm trying to get across to you. Our thesis statement is that Native Americans contained everything we associate with civilization except an easily transmittable form of writing. So what I'm trying to do here is present evidence for that case. And to do that, we use image analysis. In other words, what are you seeing? Now, in class, so in a face-to-face class, I use the same slides. And I can engage the students with a lot of back and forth. Obviously, you guys are watching this sort of remotely, and I'm not trying to patronize you with any of this. But let's go through here and see what we're looking at. Let's take a look at this image in the upper left. And the background there, you can see a large structure. Well, one of the markers of civilization is an organization of labor. So in the background, we have a big giant building. That's a pyramid. So what I want you guys to be thinking about is, how do we build a pyramid? First, we have again, it's about a division of labor. First, we have a religious leader, which is another marker of civilization. They have a strong religion. If a civilization, any civilization, exhibits a strong religion, That's a sign. That's a sign that they have this ability to create a community, and that's the beginnings of civilization. So the religious leader said to the political leader, hey, the gods want a temple. Well, among the Aztecs and all of their allied and associated tribes, they had a very strong spirituality. So the chief said, what, we need a pyramid? Yes, we have to do that to worship the gods. Okay, so he went and told the people, hey, we got to build a pyramid. Now I want you to think about technology. What's the technology that you see here? In other words, what's a pyramid built of? What's the form of it? Well, it's a big giant square footprint. And so it's going to be oriented, and they all are north, south, east, and west. Another example is down in the lower right, and this is the Temple of the Sun. And it's part of a gigantic temple complex. It's enormous. The footprint of that pyramid that you kind of see in the background there is much larger than the pyramids at Giza on the Egyptian plateau outside of Cairo. So the religious leaders said, we need a pyramid. We've got to worship the gods. The political leader said, we got to have a pyramid. He said that to all the people. So they laid out the footprint of it, and that requires engineers. Then a whole bunch of other people went out there and started cutting stone. In other words, we can't just pile up a bunch of rocks and call it a pyramid. No, they have to be cut. Then they have to be laid in there, and then the pyramid is, slowly but surely built. And then steps are built to the side. And then a temple is put in at the top, as you can see there in that image on the upper left. So behind the scenes are a whole bunch of other people in this community, and they're doing all the farming. So the stone cutters and the masons and the engineers can do what they're doing. And presumably the political leader was over it all, saying, listen, you're going to get this much food and you'll get that much food, and, encouraging the farmers to overproduce to feed the entire community. And so when we think of these Native Americans, what I want you to get out of your head is the idea that they're just running around in grass skirts harpooning buffalo. That's not the way it worked. They have a strong political system. They have a strong religious system. They have technology that they felt was important for their community. Back in the day, they would say, well, these Native Americans, they hadn't invented the wheel. That's ridiculous. Of course they had the wheel. They just didn't need it. They didn't feel like they needed that. In other words, what's the controlling interest behind having a cart with wheels on it? Believe it or not, it's the road. Well, if you're living in the Yucatan Peninsula, where the jungle will overgrow everything, if you put in a road to use a cart with a wheel on it, all day, every day, you're having to chop back the jungle to keep the road open. Instead, take your trade goods, put them in a big giant bag, use a harness to put the bag on yourself, and just walk it. That's what they actually did. So, again, back in the day, before we had good archaeology and good understanding of these things and good analysis, people would make sport of these Mesoamericans for not having the wheel. Well, of course they had the wheel. They just didn't need it in their technology. But whether or not they had strong technology, the evidence lies before you. Let's switch to this image over here on the upper right. And I want you guys to take a look at all the colors here in this image. The image itself is the Aztec god of war. And take a look at all the colors there. We know he's the god of war. If you'll take a look at his hand that's pointing out there, the hand is mangled up. And he's got a sort of a hatchet thing tied to his arm. And in his other hand, he has a shield and a bunch of arrows. And this symbolizes the Aztec god of war. But take a look at the colors. So how many colors do you guys see here? 6, 7, 8 colors. Ochre, black, red, all these different colors. Well, the image itself was made thousands or hundreds of years ago, many hundreds of years ago. And it's just as bright now as the day it was made. So think of this as a species of chemistry. In other words, if I laid any of you out there in the countryside, if I set you down the countryside out there and said, hey, go out and find a mechanism whereby we can get these colors, this sort of yellow ochre color and these bright reds and the greens that you see there and the blues. So what would you use? Sometimes people talk about how they're going to use blood for the red. No, blood is filled with a chemical called hematite, and it'll rust. It's made of iron, basically. And it'll rust and turn black and turn brown and will be red. So they found all sorts of other vegetable dyes that have held their color for many, many hundreds of years. And so this is strong chemistry. Again, this is Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, the Aztec god of war, and you don't want to get that wrong. If you upset the gods, bad things can happen. In the lower left, you see a gigantic calendar, and it's all painted. The paint has stuck to the stone for many hundreds of years. It's a tremendous mathematical formula to get the calendars exactly right. A few years ago, there was a huge controversy. They said, well, these various calendars are accurate all the way out until today. And they said, but then the calendar ends. Well, they said, well, that indicated the Aztecs thought it was going to be the end of the world. No, it's just that's when the calendar ended. They didn't feel like they were going to need it past 2021, which is when the calendar actually ended. But think of what it took, all the math, all the calculations, observations of the sun and the moon to figure out how to make an absolutely accurate calendar that was accurate many hundreds and hundreds of years after the person who created the calendar was dead. This is amazing technology. So when we think of these Native Americans, don't be thinking that they are just running around in a grass skirt looking for some buffalo to murder. They have technology. They have division of labor. They have a strong religious system. And, as we're about to see in a minute, they actually have a very strong legal system. So, with that in mind, let's go to the next slide. Now, in this particular slide, we see a lot of imagery going on here. And the idea that I'm trying to convey to you guys is that they have everything we associate with civilization except an easily transmittable form of writing. Now, they have writing, it's just not easy to transmit. So, as an example, let's look over here on the image on the right, this really complex image. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see that there is a political leader. There's a symbol of a temple. You can kind of see right between some of these major areas. There's little footprints there. You can see them in black. That's the only part of this thing that I can read is that those footprints are there. Well, that indicates they're traveling. So they arrived at a different palace and they took care of all sorts of business. Now I want to draw your attention to all of those little bitty dots. Some are yellow and white, some are red. Those are calendar markers. All along the right side of the image, especially the lower right, you can see other calendar markers. And so the dots indicate the day. Then the next thing is a sort of a symbol, an ideogram, and you have little lines showing how to read it. In other words, these days go to that month, which goes to this year. Sort of in the middle of the right side, you can see two images that are almost identical. So here is something that happened in the same year, but different months and different days. And so please understand, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm driving at. A scribe, another technician, knew how to make these images so that anybody could see them and they would be repeated. They would be accurate and they would be repeated so there could be no mistake, no misinterpretation. You see a little symbol there in a couple of places of a little kind of like a deer head or a rabbit's head. This is a month marker. And they're different year markers. different day markers. And so they do have writing that has clear indications. It's just not easy to transmit. In other words, a scribe would have to take years and years and years to understand how to do this. Also, please take another look at all the colors that are involved here. A lot of very vivid reds, this yellow color. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, I've done my homework on all this stuff, and this yellow color is very important because even the Romans had a very difficult time coming up with yellow that would be color fast. They had an extremely difficult time to do this. So here are the Aztecs, who we think of as a primitive people. No. In many ways, they outdid the Romans. Let's take a look at this image on the left. Now, this we know from a variety of interpretations is a court case. And let me draw your attention to the middle at the very, very upper edge of this image. So the individual there, again, in class, I try to get people to work this out. But the individual there is the accused. And he's being portrayed as being naked. He has no clothing. So this symbolizes equality before the law. Now, again, please think about that for a minute. In Europe in the 1500s, 14 and 1500s, did they have equality before the law? Well, it turns out they did not. You had a court set aside for the ecclesiastics, the church courts. And if priests did something wrong, then they had to go to the church court. Then you had the court for the nobility. If the nobility did something wrong, it was a court of their peers, a court of the barons. It was the court, of the king. And then they had the court of common law. But the Aztecs are saying, no, the law is much more, it applies to everyone. There's equality before the law. Well, this is an extremely sophisticated concept. We don't really get that in European law until the very late 1700s and through the 1800s. Take a look at these individuals, these four individuals that are holding up what looks like little sticks. Those are actually scrolls that are sort of wound up. And these individuals, this is a symbol. It is the symbol of a lawyer. So the Aztecs said, behold, the law is extremely complex. So everybody gets a lawyer. Well, again, in European courts at the time, especially the Court of Common Appeals, the Court of Common Law, you were your own lawyer unless you could afford a lawyer. You had to do it yourself. But the Aztecs are saying, no, everybody deserves a good defense. Everybody deserves to have, the prosecution team's got to be there. You have to have a defense team. At the lower edge of this same image, you see a sort of a rectangular structure there with, I don't know, it looks like a little hammer or something on it. Well, this symbolizes the court, the actual courthouse. You have a judge down there. He's looking at the evidence. The standing fellow over there with that little symbol in front of his face, that's a symbol that means he's talking. And we will see that symbol many times again. And he's talking to the accused to try to get him to confess. The judge is looking at the evidence, and he's listened to what's going on here, and he's going to judge the case. Well, to us, this sounds quite normal. But again, we're trying to understand that this is happening in the 1400s. And that's not the way most court cases went in Europe. It's just they had a completely different way of upholding the law. So last but not least, the Aztecs were really clear about making sure that the law was as it was written and individuals do the case. And what I'm driving at here is in Europe at the time, you could adjudicate, you could ask one other individual to get involved in the hearings and sort of pass judgment. And you could appeal to God. In European courts at the time, you could appeal to God. And so the way you would do that, there were a variety of ways, but usually the way you appeal to God in a court case is trial by combat. So you say, listen, I disagree with all the outcomes of this case, and I think I'm innocent, and I want a trial by combat. And we'll let God decide. And you could go out there, get all up in your armored suit and the sword and shield, and the court would appoint their champion with a sword and a shield, and you'd fight it out. And if you were the first one to cut the other guy, then you were innocent. If the prosecution's guy cut you first, then you were guilty, and that was that. Please understand, ladies and gentlemen, in English law, the last time that happened was in the 1830s. Some fellow that knew a little bit about the law and committed some heinous crime or whatever, was accused of it at any rate. He said he wanted trial by combat. And everybody looked at all the law books and they said, well, that's actually allowable under English law. It has not been sunsetted. That law has not gone away. It has not died off. So they actually did have to do that. They get all dressed up in armor and go out there, and the defendant goes out there and fights it out. Now, after that, English law did change, and they said no more trial by combat. But under Aztec law, that had never been a part of it. The gods have to stay out of it. Yes? So think how sophisticated all of this is. The Native Americans had everything that we associate with civilization except an easily transmittable form of writing. They had writing. It's just not easy to transmit. They have a sophisticated law system. They have a division of labor. They have a strong, powerful religion. They have a governmental hierarchy. All of these things indicate civilization. All right, so with that in mind, we've got to proceed a little bit. We've got to keep this thing going. Let's head to North America with all this. So I just want to broaden our horizons a little bit here. Minimal notes on this particular slide, but I just want you to be thinking of the bigger picture. Up in North America, and I've given you a few examples here, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different tribes. And they're, broadly speaking, they're delineated by their language. And we'll talk more about that later. You can see here I've listed some Pequots, Narragansetts, Pamunkeys, Wampanoags, Ojibwas, and Tlingits. And so this is a wide spectrum of various tribes that are in North America, and they all have those same attributes, the attributes that we associate with civilization. They have a division of labor. They have a strong spirituality. They have a form of government. They have recognized laws. They just don't have an easily transmittable form of writing. So thousands of tribes, hundreds of tribes up in there in North America. But with that in mind, let's go ahead and see if we can't, find a way to show examples, that is to say, that they had the same civilization that we would think of with the Aztecs and later on the Inca. We're talking about the Cahokian and Mississippi cultures here, Mississippian culture. And so this was active all up and down the Mississippi River Valley, as far north as modern-day Canada and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Observe the map there on the right side of the image. And so we have huge communities all up and down the Mississippi River Valley, up and down the Ohio River Valley, well into the south, also as far out as Texas and Oklahoma, away from the river. And these communities interacted with one another. There was trade, there was communication, there was interaction with one another. In that image on the upper left, you can see that in North America, they had pyramids as well. Now, they're referred to as mound builders because their building material of choice was usually mud or earth. But the pyramids that are associated with this are as big as the pyramids at Giza. In other words, these people are doing the same thing that the Egyptians had done thousands of years before. Now, the significance of the shape of a pyramid, I have no idea about that. That's somebody else's problem. But take a look at that modern day illustration there of the city of Cahokia. And it is a city. There's a compound there, a large plaza. There's a huge pyramid there. It's enormous. For many, many years, people thought, well, it's just a kind of a sort of a small, odd-shaped mountain. And so it took modern archaeologists to go out there and take a look at it and say, no, this was a gigantic pyramid, and it is. It's huge. It takes forever to climb up there. They have concrete steps moving up to the top now. And you're going to be worn out by the time you get to the top of this thing, and the view is incredible. I've only been to it once, and that was many, many years ago. But take a look at this, ladies and gentlemen. This is a huge city, and that requires laws. It requires a government. It requires a division of labor. There have to be warriors that are going to protect the city. There have to be laws on the books so that a trader coming to your town, your city here, and giving up furs or food or whatever they're going to do, they're going to get a fair value for their products. And if they feel that they've been robbed or cheated, they can take it to the government and get it straightened out. So an extremely complex society, and as you can see, it's all up and down the Mississippi River Valley for over 1,000 miles. That's how influential this culture was. It's amazing. So to reiterate, we're talking about a huge set of civilizations, North, Central, and South America, the New World. And they have everything that we associate with civilization except this easily transmittable form of writing. So with that in mind, we're going to transition now and start talking about the age of discovery. In other words, this is going to be bad for the Native Americans, but we've got to get the Europeans involved. So let's move on and talk about this age of discovery, this contact between Europe and the Native Americans in the New World. Let's begin talking about the Europeans and their contact with the Native Americans in the New World. So first, again, strong note here, the New World is North, Central, and South America. The New World is not what turned out later on to be America. The New World is North, Central, and South America. It's the entire continent all the way from the Arctic Circle down to the South Pole almost. So the Europeans had different ways, different mechanisms of dealing with the Native Americans. That's a sort of a macro thesis statement. The Europeans, primarily the Spanish, the French, and the English, had different mechanisms for dealing with the Native Americans. So these different mechanisms are different from each other. They're unique to each one of these countries, the Spanish, the French, and then the English. So if we zoom down one, we're going to start talking about the Spanish first. The Spanish first. The Europeans, primarily the Spanish, the French, and the English, had different mechanisms for dealing with the Native Americans. What characterizes the Spanish in their interactions with the Native Americans is trade's increase, spread the word of God, plunder and glory. What characterizes the Spanish interaction with the Native Americans in the New World is trade's increase, spread the word of God, plunder and glory. Now settle in, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this slide. This is foundational, so please take strong notes. We're having to go back to Europe, and we're going to have to do that a lot in 1301, the first half of 1301. We're going to go back and forth to Europe a lot. So I'll always try to emphasize where we are as we're going through the information, whether we're in Europe or if we're in the New World. I'll try and say that. But if you get lost, try and use your common sense. But back up the video a little bit and try and catch it. So we're back in Europe. It's the 1490s, the 1480s, the 1490s, the late 15th century. And in Portugal, there was a very important king there, and his name is Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator. Now, as you all know, Portugal faces the Atlantic Ocean. The big city there is Lisbon. The harbor there is called the Tagus. And Prince Henry the Navigator understood that Portugal's future rested upon travel by sea. More about that in a minute. But Prince Henry said, all right, well, we got to figure this travel by sea. We got to figure this thing out. It's not just a matter of just hoisting a sail and going out there and hoping for the best. So he established a school in Portugal. And here he gathered all of the instruments, he gathered all the maps, he gathered all the experts, he gathered all the mathematicians, all the geographers, he gathered everybody that he could that was associated with anything that had to do with navigation. And he started this enormous school. And this was extremely influential. So if you go to the side of the school today, out there where the plaza was at, the school burned down and got hit by an earthquake and burned to the ground several hundred years ago. But where the plaza is at, there's a gigantic compass made of a mosaic. And it's huge, like it's about the size of a basketball court. And it's like a compass face. In other words, it's north, south, east, and west. And it's all set up there. So you can imagine that that was just this gigantic outdoor classroom. Well, the first man that we need to talk about then is Christopher Columbus. There's his image there on the upper left. He was the product of this school. He'd learned how to navigate. So when we think of Christopher Columbus, we have to think of a very important navigator. He's school trained. So the next dynamic is the motive. So we have the ability now to travel by sea, and we have a motive. And the motive is money, trade. And that's our first, that's what we're talking about now with the Spanish. Trade's increase. Strong note here. There had been trade between Europe and China going back to Roman times, going back to ancient Rome. I want to be clear. As far as we know, no Chinese person ever went to Rome, and no Roman person ever went to China. Sidebar, there was an archaeological expedition on the island of Taiwan, and very intriguingly, they were digging around on some old ruins and turned up some Roman coins. So there was a lot of excitement in the archaeological world about that, and everybody was crying, you know, foul, this is a hoax. It turned out to be real. So Roman coins in an ancient Chinese structure, that was that has yet to be explained. But what's coming from China is going towards Europe. It's going down the Silk Road, Samarkand, and then through Baghdad, and then to the Eastern Mediterranean, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, the Syrian coast, Turkey, and through there. Well, as these goods are coming from China, and it boils down to just a couple of really important goods, silk is one of them. That's why it's called the Silk Road. And really exotic spices. A sidebar on this, and you're going to find out that I'm full of little stories like this. I read all the time, and I do my homework. During the French wars, during the Napoleonic Wars, some French soldiers were in Marseille, went into a restaurant and started eating. And one of them started crying out and screaming and yelling, and he's saying, I've been poisoned, I've been poisoned. And the rest of the soldiers got their guns, and they got ready to shoot the restaurant guy, the cook. They were going to shoot everybody. And so they straightened it out. What the soldier was tasting was pepper. So a French soldier in the early 1800s from Paris had never tasted pepper before. That's how rare these spices are. So when we talk about exotic spices like cinnamon, various peppers, all sorts of other anise and all sorts of other exotic spices coming down the Silk Road, look, this stuff was extremely expensive. Continue on with strong notes. As it's moving from China to the Mediterranean, at every stop, the merchants have to pay a tax. It may be little or it may be big, but it just adds to the cost of the goods. So by the time these goods reach the Mediterranean, where they can be sent straight on to Europe, they're hideously expensive. Not necessarily because of the price of the product, which is bad enough, but because every one of these products had collected a tax all the way going back to China along the Silk Road. So your target market for these goods, and it's all about following the money now, the target market for these goods is going to be the nobility, the highest ranks of nobility in Europe. They're the only ones that can afford this stuff. Fast forward to the 1480s, 1490s. And Christopher Columbus and a whole lot of other people. We're talking about, hey, gee, I want to cash in on this. There's money to be made here. He goes to the School of Navigation. What did he discover? The world is round like a ball, not round like a plate of spaghetti. Okay? Now, I'm going to dispel a little bit of a myth here. Maps going back to the 1200s showed conclusively and unambiguously that the Europeans understood that the world was not flat, that it was round. You could see it. If you got a little bit of elevation, everything else around you was kind of flat, then you could see that the world is round like a ball. It's obvious. So this idea that everybody was flat Earth until, well, some people think that even today. No. The world is round like a ball. So Christopher Columbus and the people in the school put two and two together, and they said, listen, why don't we make a lot of money by going direct to China? Let's go directly to them. Then we don't have to pay all these taxes to Islamic countries, which is very upsetting to the Europeans. So Christopher Columbus, some of these other guys sat down and said, okay, well, what would be the distance? Let's calculate that out. And therein, ladies and gentlemen, lies a problem. Somewhere along the line, somebody forgot to carry the one. And so they miscalculated the size of the planet by about 10,000 miles. I'm going to kind of give them a break on that. If I were to try and calculate the size of the planet by, using a chalkboard, well, no. Well, inside that missing 10,000 miles was the New World, of which the Europeans knew nothing. Sometimes I'll get somebody in class to stick up their hands. They'll say, well, what about the Vikings? Okay, so the Vikings, it's unambiguous that they traveled to North America. But they didn't do anything with that knowledge. That knowledge was lost hundreds and hundreds of years before Columbus. So now we're taking a look at this discovery of the New World from the point of view of Christopher Columbus and the fact that it's going to lead to something else. As you all know, Christopher Columbus, he goes to the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, and he asks for some ships. He's going to go do this thing. Go to China, presumably establish this trade route, pick up a lot of really cool stuff, come back to Spain and sell it for cheap. Cut out the middleman. You can make a lot of bank doing that if you can just pull off the stunt. So this requires a little bit of context. In Spain in 1492, a lot of tremendous things, earth-shattering things happened in Spain in 1492, the year that Christopher Columbus sailed for the New World. Well, sailed for China and encountered the New World. So in Spain, for centuries it had been two separate kingdoms, Castile and Aragon. And in 1492, they united with the marriage of Ferdinand of Castile and Isabella of Aragon. Another momentous event took place in Spain that same year, 1492. There had been a Muslim invasion all the way back in the 700s. And here in the 1490s, in 1492, the last of the Muslim kingdoms in Cordoba was expelled. They were sent back to North Africa. Last but not least, and this is a kind of a dark chapter in European history, but important for us here, at the time when the Muslim kingdoms were finally expelled, Ferdinand and Isabella insisted that all the Jews have to leave as well. All the Hebrews had to get out. They could accept Christianity and be forced into Christianity, and they could stay. But if they maintained their faith, then they had to leave Spain. So with all these tremendous things going on, along comes this Christopher Columbus character and says, hey, give me some ships, let me go do this thing. I got this idea. And so he got his 3 ships and off he went. And they thought, well, we're never going to see that character again. He's gone and he's never coming back. So he's going to swallow him up. Strong note. Christopher Columbus never, ever set foot on continental North or Central America. Never. He did 4 different journeys, and all he ever encountered was islands in the Caribbean. It's part of the Leeward Islands. It's, I don't know, St. Lucia and in through there. He encountered those islands, sailed around, found more islands, sailed around, found some more islands, lost a couple of ships, lost a lot of men. But he never encountered continental America. Never. The important contribution of Christopher Columbus is that he brought back a map. He went to the School of Navigation. He brought back a map. And the map showed that if you travel this direction for this many days, you're going to encounter these islands. And until he died, he was convinced that these islands were off the coast of China. And if you just traveled a little bit farther west, you would get to China. Now, technically, that's true. If you travel further west, you will get to China on that latitude. But of course, the New World is in the way, and he just didn't know that. That leads us then to the next individual in our saga, and that is Hernan Cortez. Now, I do want you guys to write a little bit of, I got a background on this guy, and I want you to write down a little bit of a note on him. And the note that's important here is Hernan Cortez. In some documents, Hernando Cortez. And sometimes it's an S, not a Z, at the end of his name. Was minor nobility back in Spain, petty nobility. But the family was actually poor. And that happened a lot, evidently. He had a lot of name, he had a lot of title, very important person, but they didn't have any money. And that made our man, Hernan Cortez, very hungry for bucks. He wanted money all the time. He was always on the lookout. So the year now is 1519. Cortez is there in Spain. He approaches the king and queen. He says, listen, I want to go to the New World and make bank. And they're like, yeah, go do like everybody else. In the meantime, a small colony has been established on the island of Cuba. Cortez arrives there in Cuba, and he says to the governor general there in Cuba, hey, give me more men and more ships, and I'll go find China. I'll keep on going west. Now, think this all the way through, ladies and gentlemen. The governor had a lot to do. He's trying to build this community here in Cuba. He's trying to put together things. He's got limited resources, limited men, no ships. But again, Hernan Cortez, born poor, well motivated to find money, well motivated to try and pay, make a fast dollar. is not a man to take no for an answer, and that's the next important thing about him. He doesn't settle for a no. He hounded the governor of Cuba, argued, negotiated, debated, and finally the governor said, listen, here's a couple of ships, here's some useless men, get out of here, and I hope I never find you again. I hope you never come back. So in 1519, Cortez went farther west and landed in the modern town of Veracruz in modern-day Mexico. October 31st, 1519, Cortez is going to land in Veracruz, modern-day Mexico. He arrives there and tells the soldiers and the sailors, start unloading the ships, unload the ships, unload the ships, unload the ships. And so they did that. They unloaded the ships, got everything off the ships that they could. And he said to them, is everything off the ships? Yeah, everything's off the ship. So he went back out to the ships and burned them. Burned the ships. Back on shore, he said, now it's either victory or death. You must follow me or die. So, as you can apprehend, that's quite a little symbol there, quite a little step. Now, the next part of this, there's a lot of debate about this, a lot of discussion. The Native Americans who were living in that area, Aztecs or Aztec-associated tribes, saw these people and said, wow, we need to go down there and talk to them and find out exactly what's going on. And here is where those two cultures came together. For those of you guys who are interested, my resource here is Michael Woods. Conquistadors is the name of his book. Michael Woods is a very important professor in Cambridge University back in England, and he researched this very thoroughly. And so he's my resource here. So in the Aztec spirituality, there was this rather obscure story about how the gods had retreated, but one day they would reappear. And they would come from the east where the sun rises. And so here's Cortez and his men, and they came out of the east where the sun rises, and they were clearly different. So let's explore, again, this meeting, this clash of cultures, a little bit more thoroughly to try and understand what's going on. Cortez was, in fact, wearing armor, as you see in that image there. Well, armor like that was like completely unknown to the Native Americans. And I have to say, it must have been miserable for Cortez in Mexico, wearing a tin suit. Are you kidding me? But it's so alien. Furthermore, Cortez, and in some of the images some of the paintings we see, this is disputed, but in his writings, he talked about this a lot. Cortez was actually very fair complected. He was he was European. When we think of Spanish people, I'm not trying to be racist here, we think of Spanish people as having, darker skin sort of, and dark hair. But Cortez was European, and so he had actually very fair hair and light complected. In his own writings, he talked bitterly about how he's getting sunburned all of the time. Now picture, if you will, these Native Americans, the Aztecs, seeing a fellow all dressed in this brightly shining metal suit, and he's got fair hair and blue eyes and a very, very light complexion. Well, to the Aztecs, he must have looked like an alien from another planet. One of the Aztecs kind of came up to him and gestured and said, hey, what's that thing that you got, kind of hanging by your side? And Cortez, pulled out and he drew his sword and he said, it's a weapon sort of thing. And the Native American took a look at it and grabbed it by the blade. Well, you and I know that's a mistake. It was cut. So again, the Native Americans had never seen a steel weapon like that. Never. Now, I want to settle an issue, and I want you guys to, you don't have to take a note on this, but don't forget it either. And this is the language barrier. How did this get overcome? Again, this is foundational, and you need to know this. Don't take a note, but don't forget it either. And the way this was done, the Europeans knew to do this, and as it turns out, the Native Americans, including the Aztecs, knew how to do this as well. They knew to do this. What you're going to do is take a young person, 10 or 12 years old, and trade them for a young person of the other culture. And young people have a way of picking up a language really, really fast. They'll learn it quickly. The mechanism is called total immersion. You know, you trade your guide and you give him one in return. So that had happened on the island of Cuba, where the Native Americans there spoke a version of Nahuatl, which is the Aztec language. So Cortez already had a couple of translators with him. Another one is called Equito, and he was actually from Africa. He was an African, but he was a translator. Cortez certainly isn't going to need him to translate any African languages, but he's trying. He's already trying to think of how to overcome the language barrier. So he had a translator with him that could get from Spanish into Nahuatl. He had brought him with him from Cuba. So the communication could move forward. This is going to happen in North America. It will happen with the Incas. You're always going to be trading children back and forth. A young English child came back to England years later, having been put into this situation. And when it had taken place, he recalled it, and he said in a letter, yeah, I knew I was being sold into slavery. That's what he thought. But instead, he's just being traded so that we could open up the language barrier. So that will be a dynamic moving forward. Please don't forget it. Cortez begins moving inland, and he begins to learn things. Now we're going to transition on to the next slide. I have Francisco Pizarro up there, and I have Cabeza de Vaca there. And Francisco Pizarro we'll talk about a lot later on. Cabeza de Vaca, he's going to be another explorer later on. And you can see on the map there, he's going to travel through the Florida Panhandle and all through the Old South, as it were. So there's going to be a whole lot of traveling going on here. But we're going to continue to focus on Cortez now. Then we'll transition to the Pizarro brothers later on, shortly. So here I'm presenting you with a modern map of what's going on in Mesoamerica. That is to say, pre-Columbian, before the Age of Discovery, what's going on in Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire. So you can see that there's all sorts of smaller kingdoms, and some of these are tributary states. That is to say that the Aztecs are governing them, and they have to pay taxes to the Aztecs. Others are more or less independent. The Mayans further south, they were very much a culture that's in very steep decline. Even today, people are not various archaeologists, various philologists are trying to figure out exactly what was causing the Maya to decline the way they did. But that's what was going on. Well, we're only worried right now about what's going on with the Aztecs. So Cortez begins moving inland, and it's not a straight line. He's going farther up north, and he's going back down south again. He's going up north, and he's going back down south again. And everywhere he went, his translators, by this time he has many, and they're talking about how, yeah, these guys they're coming here from the east. They're gods, or they're godlike people. Strong note here. No matter where Cortez and his men went, he had about 300 guys with him, horses, he had a few cannons. No matter where they went, this idea that they were gods, that did not last long. Because as you can imagine, they ate a lot of food. Well, then they had to go to the bathroom. So gods don't have to do that. Through the normal course of their day, they would take care on all sorts of activities. And they might get cut. And they would bleed like anybody else. Well, that doesn't happen to gods. All the Spanish would want to have sex with all the young ladies. Well, then they would get pregnant. Well, that's not how gods, that's not how it works with gods. But the note that I really want you guys to take is that Cortez is learning about this civilization as he's moving inland. And a lot of these tributary tribes are very unhappy with the Aztecs. The Aztecs are taking their wealth, especially they're taking their young men for human sacrifice. They're taking their food. The Aztecs are keeping these tributary tribes weak so they can be more easily governed. These people know that that's what's going on, and they're very, very unhappy. Cortez is a European, and he has seen this sort of thing going on his entire life. That's what happens throughout all of Europe. And he tucks that little piece of information away. Here is a subject people. They're being governed rather harshly by these, this one tribe called Aztecs, and they're unhappy. Well, that's a place where you can find an advantage. And Cortez does not forget that. But during his entire voyage, everybody keeps saying, keep moving inland, keep going inland, keep going farther west. And then you'll finally run into the Aztecs, who are sort of the bosses. And we don't like them. Eventually, Cortez and his men arrive in Tenochtitlan. That's the capital city of the Aztec Empire. And that's where we're going to go to right now. Here are a couple of artistic renditions of what Tenochtitlan looked like as Hernan Cortez would have seen it in about 1520, 1521, somewhere in there. Tenochtitlan was on a huge island. Parts of the island were artificial. And it is the location of modern-day Mexico, Mexico City. Today, of course, they've filled in all the lake, and there's no vestige of the lake left. But they do archaeological digs from time to time, and they find out all kinds of things left over that have been buried, destroyed, and then buried. Cortez saw the giant plaza that you see there on the lower right. And I want to be clear on something, strong note here. This was by far the biggest city he had ever seen in his life. Cortez had been to Madrid. He'd been to Cadiz. Cadiz is a Roman city. There are Roman ruins there now. In different parts of, over by Barcelona, there is a bull ring there. There's actually a Roman Colosseum. That is the oldest continuously occupied building on planet Earth that we know of. The Romans put it in, and they've been using it as an arena to this very day. I'm recording this in 2023, and they're still using that as an arena, this Roman structure. But nothing compared to what he's seeing here with Tenochtitlan. Huge city. Everybody was immaculately dressed. Cortez talked about how clean it was. No real odors. You can imagine all these European cities, they're just taking their human waste and throwing it in the streets. Pigs are routinely out there rooting around in garbage, and they're leaving their mess everywhere they go. But Tenochtitlan was spotlessly clean. Everybody was immaculately dressed. They had huge feather headdresses all over. It was amazing. And this was the largest city by far that Cortez had ever seen. Strong note here. At that point, and this is what uh, historians have discovered through Cortez's own writing. At this point, his motive changed from trade's increase to plunder and glory. He saw a mechanism whereby he could dominate this community, the Aztec Empire. And the way he's going to do it, ladies and gentlemen, strong note now, his motive has changed from trade's increase to plunder and glory. And the way he's going to do this is divide and conquer. He goes into Tenochtitlan, meets the leader there, very famously, Montezuma. There have been an earlier one, so today in most textbooks he's referred to as Montezuma II. He's treated as royalty, welcomed in. Everybody wants to talk to them. It's an amazing thing. They had heard messages. The Aztecs had heard messages from the other tribes. Somebody came in, a messenger had come in and said, yes, they're on their way. And by the way, they have these gigantic animals, and we don't know what's going on with that. And they were questioned very carefully. These messengers were very carefully questioned. What do you mean, these gigantic animals? Well, think for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, how would you actually describe a horse to someone who's never seen a horse? Well, you would say, well, they're big. Well, you know, how big is big? Is it like big like a shoebox? What do you mean big? And it's got 4 legs. Okay, well, you know, what else? And so somebody asked, the men, they ride these things? Or do you mean that they grow out of these animals? Like some sort of centaur or something? And finally, the best thing they could hit upon, it was like a big giant dog. The Aztecs knew what a dog was, and it was like a big giant dog. And it was like, oh, okay, all right, well, we'll see. So this is how alien these two cultures were. Cortez gets there. He's very much welcomed. But pretty soon, he becomes more and more arrogant. This whole idea of him being a god has gone to his head by this time. He's trying to dominate the Aztecs. He's trying to, like, take over. They come to recognize that he and his men are not any species of god at all. They're men like any other men. And they have particularly bad manners and bad odors and bad habits. By this time, Cortez had 2 or 3 mistresses, and he had children by them, and it was not going well. Continue on with strong notes. Eventually, the Aztecs got good and fed up with Cortez and all of his nonsense and chased him out. You can see in that image, the upper image there are causeways, sort of land bridges over to the rest of Mexico. And Cortez and the last of his men barely did make it. Many of them were killed. They fired their cannons, but by this time their gunpowder was older, 2 or 3 years old. Gunpowder from that era, it just did not hold up very well in humidity. So it wasn't looking too good for Cortez and his men. This is when he goes back to the other tribes and says, look, I came there as a friend. I came there as this god. I came there to, like, help out. And they've chased me away. They've hunted me. We've got to team up and we've got to deal with these Aztecs. That's what he's telling all these tributary tribes. And of course, these other tribes are like, well, where have you been this whole time? Yeah, we're going to follow you. Let's go. So when we try and think of how just a few hundred Spaniards could overthrow the Aztec Empire, which contained many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals, the idea is to divide and conquer. He has many thousands of allies among the Native Americans. They march on Tenochtitlan. They're able to overthrow the Aztec government. Montezuma is murdered. Cortez takes over, and it begins to play one side off against the other. Weaken them again. Continue on with strong notes. Now it's about this time, 1522, 1525, somewhere in there. Cortez is like, okay, I gotta make this good back in the home country, back in Spain. So he says to some of his men, go back to the coast, take a bunch of tools with you, build a small ship, go back to Cuba, and take this box with a message and a little present with you. Take it back to Cuba and make sure that this gets back to Spain to the king. So these men, they mount up and they move back to the coast. Again, this is going to take weeks. All of this has taken weeks and weeks, months and months and months. They get to the coast. They build another ship, a small ship. They sail back to Cuba. The governor of Cuba opens up the little box, and in it is a bunch of gold and silver, and a basically little note from Cortez saying, "Nana nana poo poo, you treated me bad and kicked me out. Look at me. Now I'm the king of this gigantic empire in the name of the king of Spain. So send the messenger back to Spain saying that I've conquered this huge empire in the name of the king of Spain." And that's how he made it all right with the Spanish. In other words, he didn't set himself up as an independent ruler. He did it all for Spain. But he, Cortez, was going to be in charge. The messenger gets back to Spain, opens up the box. Here's all this gold and silver. This really carefully worded message from Cortez saying, hey, you might not have known this, but now you have this gigantic empire in the New World, all done in your name, Your Majesty. Now we're going to talk about how the Spanish actually governed in the New World coming up in a little while. But we need to transition and get back on track a little bit. The Spanish had three different mechanisms for dealing with the Native Americans. Trade's increase, and that's Christopher Columbus. And then that kind of went away with Cortez. And it turns to plunder and glory. But we need to take a minute and explore this idea of spread the word of God. And that's going to be Pizarro, Francisco Pizarro, and his two brothers, Gonzalo and Juan. So let's go down to South America and follow the exploits of the Pizarro brothers. On this slide, we need to discuss what's going on in South America with the Inca Empire. Now, for this, we need to talk about Francisco Pizarro, and that leads us back to Europe. It's the late 1520s, early 1530s. We're back in Spain. Francisco Pizarro and his brothers, once again, they fit that pattern established by Cortez 30 years before. They're a family with minor noble connections, minor nobility, petty aristocracy, but they're dirt poor, very, very poor. One of the stories about Francisco Pizarro as a young man, as a kid, he was a pig herder, which is pretty low down the totem pole, but he didn't have pork to eat. To stay alive, he had to eat lizards. So that's like really, that's bad. And so throughout his entire life, he's well motivated to gain wealth any way he can. He's always on the makeout. He's always on the lookout for money. So in the 1520s, he had been with Balboa. They had landed in modern-day Panama. They had not crossed over the Panama Isthmus to see the Pacific, but the feeling was that that was the place to try and get across. A few years passed by. Francisco Pizarro's got another ship, another expedition. Lands near modern-day Panama, where the canal is at, crosses over, gets to the Pacific, and he is actually trying to start trade with some new civilization. He's trying. He's an explorer, a conquistador, but he's got good motives. Well, I want you guys to think this all the way through. So he starts in Spain loads up all sorts of trade goods, things that he thinks will sell with these Native Americans. They know a little bit about what's going to be, profitable because of what Cortez is doing. They load all this up onto ships, cross the Atlantic, land in modern-day Panama. Of course, there was no canal zone going through there at the time, and so they have to load all this stuff up and transport it across the isthmus to the Pacific through the steaming, sweltering heat of a jungle. There on the Pacific side, they've got to build another ship. They do. The ship actually, they set sail. There's Pizarro, and he's in charge. He's a navigator like anybody else, like many others. The ship wrecks. He was able to save part of the cargo, but most of the crew perished. Months went by. Another ship came along and picked him up, and he continues on with his voyage. So they land in modern-day northern Chile or southern Ecuador. They land on the coast there. Later on, that'll be part of Bolivia, and then that gets cut off by Chile in a later war, but that's a separate issue. And he starts going up the Andes, traveling up the Andes. So with this in mind, let's switch to the Inca side. There had been some contact between the Inca and the Aztec Empire going back many centuries. The Inca knew that there was a people on up there. The Aztecs knew about the Inca as well, but it was a minimal contact. We're not talking about trading ambassadors and doing all sorts of trade or anything like that. But they knew of each other's existence. Well, the leader of the Inca Empire at that time was named Atahualpa. And it's kind of spelled, if you look at the black and white illustration there on the right side of the image, it says Conquista, and then Atahualpa, Inca Ciudad, the city of Atahualpa, king of the Inca. And so Atahualpa had heard about these goings on in the Aztec Empire and that gods had arrived, or some convoluted form of that story. So he told all of his people, let these visitors continue to climb the Andes and get to the capital of the Inca Empire there. It was Cuzco, and you can see it on the map there on the far left side of the image. That dark red dot there, that's Cuzco, the very heart of the Inca Empire. So, after many adventures and carrying all these trade goods through its shipwreck and then up the Andes Mountains, Pizarro arrives. Strong note here. In the meantime, back in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, they're long dead. The king now is Philip II, and Philip I and Philip II both were very, very powerfully religiously motivated. And they'd passed a series of laws and ordinances, strong note now, saying that no further expedition to the New World can go without a priest. You must spread the word of God. You must have that as a motive. And Pizarro did have a priest with him. Again, you can see it on that illustration on the kind of the upper right. There is Atahualpa seated. He's got his Inca people in behind him. There is Pizarro kind of kneeling down, and he's got a clerk right next to him. Well, Pizarro had spread his goods there on the ground, and they were all battered and rusted, and they didn't look too good, having traveled all the way from Spain. And he had impressed upon the Inca that he is a trader. He's there to, establish trade relations. Then he handed things over to the priest. The priest had a Bible. You can see it there in his hands from this illustration from the time. This is an illustration that was drawn basically at that time. So the priest talked about what God was all about in the Christian religion, the Christian faith, and handed the Bible to Atahualpa. And the story goes, again, this is Michael Woods in his book, Conquistadors. Atahualpa riffled through the pages, raked his thumb across the pages and held the Bible up to his ears and ran his thumb through the pages several times. And he threw down the Bible and said, "Your God did not speak to me. I did not hear the voice of your God." Well, that was Pizarro's signal that he could then commit war upon the Inca. That's all it took. Ladies and gentlemen, the priest was given 3 minutes to convince the Inca to switch to Christianity. The Bible that he handed was, of course, in Latin, and it turns out that our cleric did not speak a bit of Latin, couldn't read it. And so things rapidly declined after that. Pizarro and his men were able to get control of Atahualpa. He's going to be murdered. That leads to Manco, who is in the middle illustration there on the bottom. That's Manco. You can read it in the illustration there. And Manco tried to work things out, but he had to make a run for it. Again, Atahualpa is going to be murdered. You can see that on that middle image there. I'm sorry, the image kind of on the left, that lower cartoon-looking thing. That's Atahualpa getting killed, literally being decapitated. Gonzalo helped out. Juan is going to be killed pretty early on, but Gonzalo is going to last a long time. He's going to try to help out his brother Hernando there. I'm sorry, for Francisco. And Gonzalo was evidently a serial rapist. He was a murderous individual. There was something wrong with him. Throughout all of this, he finally snatched up this Inca princess, beat her violently in front of the other Inca nobility, and violently raped her. So for any of you that know anything about this horrible, heinous crime, it's almost never about the actual sex. It's always about domination. And that's what Gonzalo was trying to exhibit here. If you read any of the histories of this, usually that part is ignored. It's canned. It's sanitized. But that's what happened. It horrified the Inca. This was a terrible, terrible, heinous crime among them. But it's all about trying to dominate the Inca. And I'm sorry to say it did work. So again, let me go over this, and I want you guys to think about it. The setting is, our main thesis is that the Europeans, primarily the Spanish, the French, and the English, have different ways of dealing with the Native Americans. We step down one as the Spanish. Trades increase, plunder and glory, spread the word of God. And here is our sort of example of spread the word of God. And Pizarro did this in the name of the king, but only let the priest have 3 minutes to try to convert them, and he switched to plunder and glory. So on analysis, ladies and gentlemen, please understand the obvious. Plunder and glory is going to be the strongest motive for the Spanish in particular, but later the French and the English, to come to the New World. So the Pizarro brothers, they set up this kingdom, and it was really almost like a mafioso sort of situation, just gangsters. They would regularly write letters back to the King of Spain saying, hey, here's the things we're doing in your name. And it was all sanitized, and it was all cleaned up. Everything was justified. More people in Spain. Everybody in Spain was talking about going to Peru. They had to go to Peru. Observers said the word Peru was on everybody's lips. They had to go to Peru. They would get there and find out that the Pizarro brothers were running this place like Gangsterville, and they would write letters back saying, hey, it's not what you think. This is terrible. What's going on here? But the Pizarro brothers would find that out, murder them, chase them into the mountains, hound them. Anybody that ratted them out, they were going to smoke them. So he got away with this for years and years and years. He was murdered later on by another Spaniard who found himself in a situation of either kill or be killed. So how do the Spanish in this particular case How do they get control of the Inca Empire? Is decapitate and replace. In contrast to what Cortez had done. He had divided and conquered. But here we have decapitate and replace. The Inca leadership is just going to be wiped out in a very short period of time. And the Spanish are going to set themselves up as the new leaders. And everybody kind of, the rest of the Inca Empire pretty much goes with that. I don't want to oversimplify this, but that's what it really boils down to. So this is going on for years and years and years. But as time goes on, the Pizarro brothers start sending back a vast treasure of wealth. Cortez is already doing that. And that's going to be a tremendous motive for anyone else to go to the New World. So let's take a look at what's going on as this age of discovery continues. As I wrote in the caption there, it is impossible to calculate the value of the vast treasure of loot, all in caps, that the Spanish took out of Mexico and the Inca Empire. Forgive my misspelling there. You just have to overlook that. I was in a jam when I was trying to get this stuff up. But I want you guys to consider what's happening back in Europe with all this. So the Spanish are robbing the Inca of every dime that they can get their hands on, every bit of the money. All of the gold and silver that you see in this illustration, that's the real stuff. It's not a modern reproduction. That's what they were taking. If it came in any sort of like bar or powder, they would melt it down, turn it into coins. They would strike all these coins. The gold coins that you see kind of in the background there on the right, those are doubloons. They were taken from a shipwreck, thousands and thousands of doubloons, tons and tons and tons and tons of gold. They had Inca workmen craft all sorts of crucifixes and plates, engravings. One of the main sources was Antigua Potosi, and you can see that kind of in the mountain there on the left. Well, the Inca had been mining that for silver for years and years and years. The Spanish are going to take it over and put them to work down the mines to say, get out more. Ladies and gentlemen, Antigua Potosi is a silver mine today. They're still pulling silver ore out of that mountain in Bolivia. It's hugely, fabulously wealthy silver strike. So it's amazing. This is all being loaded on ships and vast treasure ships, huge giant treasure chests, and sent back to Spain. Now I want you to consider the effect of what's going on back in Europe with all this gold and silver. What Spain is using this stuff for is to fund a gigantic series of wars based on religion back in Europe. Everybody in Europe understood the Spanish were robbing the Native Americans in the New World and taking that money to Spain and funding these wars. So everybody else in Europe said, for the Spanish, it's cash. The only way you're going to pay for food, cash. You have to pay for cash with everything. And Philip I, and later, especially Philip II, they were like, yeah, we'll pay for cash because we've got all this gold. Got all this gold and gold, all this silver. Well, the war got out of control. It's the 80 Years' War. Part of this is the Armada in 1588 trying to attack the English. People don't understand that's the third Spanish Armada. The first one was used in the Mediterranean, and then Francis Drake and some of these other pirates and buccaneers, we'll talk about them later, burned it. Philip II then rebuilt another fleet, sent it up against England in 1588. It was sunk in a tremendous storm. There was another fleet, and it was dispersed, burned, and used in a variety of battles, but most of the ships were improperly built and with bad wood, so it was just rotten. But every dime of that had to be paid for. So by the end of the 1500s and into the 1600s, Spain is robbing the New World and is absolutely broke. Every shipload of gold and silver has already been spent before it even arrives in Spain. It's all in hock. The other effect, strong note here, is that everybody else in Europe gets the idea that the New World is absolutely paved in gold. All you do is knock somebody on the head and take it from them. That's what the Spanish were doing. And everybody, especially the French and the English, which we'll talk about later on, they were like, well, we're better than any Spaniard that ever drew a breath. So if we go over there, we'll be able to get 10 times as much gold and silver because we're better than the Spanish. So in the first place, every dime of this is going to be spent on war, wars of religion, one after another, including the 80 Years' War, which lasted, well, as it turns out, almost 100 years. It was a 12-year break. And it motivates all these other people to come to the New World, and for no other reason than to grab the gold. So as we move forward in the background, please be cognizant of the fact that a motive for most of these people to come to the New World is going to be the promise of easy loot. You just knock somebody else on the head and take their gold and silver from them, which is exactly what the Spanish had done. So with that in mind, let's move on then and start talking about myth versus reality. In other words, there's going to be a lot of more stories back in Europe about what the Spanish are up to, what they're doing, and what's really going on. And these stories affect how we view the conquistadors to this very day. So Spanish and the Native Americans, myth versus reality. So we're back in Europe. We're back in Europe. I'm going to try and be brief on this because we need to get on with the French. Back in Europe, there's these tremendous wars going on, primarily between the Spanish, who are in the southern part of Europe, and the northern Europeans, the English, the Dutch, some of the German states, and they are all Protestant. They have switched to the Protestant faith. Well, the Spanish are deeply, deeply committed to Catholicism, and they're not going to have it. And they feel the calling from God, from the Pope, that it's up to them to go up there and cure this heresy of Protestantism. In reply, the Dutch especially are going to say and, put out this propaganda that are going to be terrible towards the Spanish. Now, please don't get lost with this. Spain's trying to take over the Dutch for dynastic reasons. They have a dynastic claim upon what were then called the United Provinces or the Seven Provinces, sometimes the Netherlands, sometimes the Dutch Republic. They called it different things. And so the Spanish want to get control of Holland, which was deeply, deeply committed to Protestantism, and either switch them back to Catholicism or kill them in the name of God. So the Dutch are well motivated to make the Spanish appear as horrible, horrible monsters. The Dutch message is, look what the Spanish are doing to these poor Native Americans. If they're going to do this to these poor Native Americans, think what they'll do to us. And so that leads to all this propaganda. So the image that you see here and on the next slide are Dutch propaganda about what the Spanish are doing to the Native Americans. So you can see in this image, we'll kind of go clockwise here, that image on the upper right. Here we see that the Spanish are beating the Native Americans, chasing them down with horses, and making them give up all the gold and silver. So here are these naked Native Americans with big pots and pans that are just gold and silver. The Spanish are hitting them with swords and whips and just beating them, chasing them about, making them give up all the gold and silver. The next image down there in the lower right corner, this is a story that just went on and on and on and on. You see kind of over on the right edge, this poor woman's hanging up, and there's a priest talking to the little child saying, listen, your mother would not convert to Catholicism, so we had to hang her up. And there she is, you know. So what you should do then is switch to the Christian faith. In the middle of that particular picture, we see a story that just went on and on and on. It was a legend that the Spanish would take a baby, cut it in two, and feed one half to one dog and the other half to another dog. In the background, you see them chasing these Native Americans around and harassing them, tormenting them. In the image on the lower left, they've tied these people up to stakes in the ground and they're just beating them. On the right edge, you see one fellow gouging out the eyes of another Native American. And you see all the little eyeballs laying there at their feet. In the middle of the foreground, they're chopping off the hands of these Native Americans, and the other ones are running about saying, behold, I have no hand. It's hard to make out, sort of, but in the far background, you see the Spanish have chased these Native Americans over a cliff, murdering them, killing them, and for no evident reason. But this is all propaganda. In case you might think that there's just one or two or three of these images, well, it turns out, ladies and gentlemen, the Dutch were good at propaganda. We can see here in a continuation of this, we'll start with that kind of colored image up at the top. They're the Spanish, and they are celebrating the fact that they've murdered all these thousands of Native Americans, and they're laying there in heaps, being fed on by the dogs. They've shot them down. They've got their arquebuses. They've got their muskets there, and they've just given these poor individuals the firing squad. Just below that on the lower right, here are the Spanish. Again, this is propaganda. They have, in the foreground, you can see the Spanish there. They're talking to Satan himself. And Satan says, okay, and he's gesturing, if you'll kiss my ass, if you'll kiss my butt, I'll do what you want. And in the background, here's all these imps let loose from hell to torment the Native Americans in the name of Spain. This is, of course, this is propaganda. In the next image, you see all these people hanging up. Well, it's not enough that they hang them up. No, they've got to put a bonfire up underneath them. And again, here's a story that has these really long legs in that. This propaganda goes on and on and on. We believe this happened. And you see some fellow swinging a baby against a rock because he didn't convert to Christianity or whatever. Up above in the upper left, they're just hunting these people down for sport, shooting them, murdering them, giving them the firing squad, hunting them down with horses and beating them and killing them. But this is all propaganda. It's to keep the people in Holland riled up and energized to fight the Spanish. If the Spanish ever got control of the Dutch Republic, this is what would happen. And so there's not one or two or three of these images, there's thousands of them. And people believe, even today, that this is the way it was. Ladies and gentlemen, if there was violence, if the debate was violence exhibited toward the Native Americans? Yes. Did many of them die? Yes. But did the Spanish, who were deeply religious, did they call upon Satan to help them? Allow me to express a doubt. Did they hang up thousands of them on a stick and then start a bonfire underneath them? Again, let me have it. I doubt it. Many of these Spanish were up to no good, but that doesn't make them these genocidal monsters. So how did the Spanish with a few people conquer a vast Aztec empire? Again, we've talked about that. Divide and conquer. How'd they do it with the Inca Empire? Decapitate and replace. So don't be, if you study other things that are going on in the New World at the time with these conquistadors, don't be deceived. Bad things did happen. That's a fact. That's a documented fact. But is it like we're seeing on these Dutch images? No. The real killer of Native Americans, as you all know, is disease. Smallpox was the big one. It's the most famous. But as modern science is like getting control of this issue, we find that influenza and yellow fever, which is mosquito borne but does come from Europe, these were big killers as well. The Native Americans had no natural immunity to these diseases. Smallpox is highly contagious, highly contagious. And so 90% of all the Native Americans are going to die of smallpox. But also, and we don't know these numbers exactly, various forms of influenza and yellow fever. Now, to be clear, and I have it up there, disease is not a weapon. It is not a weapon because the Spanish had no more control over that than anybody else. An account by Father Gamara talks about he was praying to God, help these poor people. What do we do? A very famous image there on the lower left. You see an Inca doctor. He's got that symbol to speak in front of him, and he's trying to help these poor people. In this really naive, primitive image in the upper left, again, they're trying to figure out what to do with this smallpox. Here are people laying, you see this on kind of the right side of the image, they're lying down on these mats, and they're all, they're dying. But please understand, the Spanish, the Europeans, didn't have any sort of medicine at all. None. Even the simplest medicine, aspirin, nothing. They had nothing. So when these poor people caught this, the fever obviously would just burn them down. Several modern historians who have studied this also point out, and I can imagine this is true. Listen, if you've got the guts, you can, go to Google Images, put in smallpox, and prepare to be disgusted. It's horrible. But modern historians have found that many Native Americans, having suffered through this, were so badly scarred up that they then committed suicide. They couldn't stand, what they were seeing. They could see the scars on their own bodies, their arms, hands, and everywhere, and they knew that their face and everything else was horribly, horribly disfigured by this terrible, terrible disease. And so many of the survivors would find a way to commit suicide. So how many are going to die? Millions. Now, do take a strong note here, and we're going to run into this again and again and again, and this is the pattern of the disease. In other words, the epidemiology. Strong note now, in the Aztec Empire and in the Inca Empire, we have people living in urban environments. In other words, they have large cities. We've talked about that. Even the Inca, because of, you're going to be farming up and down these mountain valleys, but the town itself will be centrally located, and then the farmers will go out from there. So if one person in this city gets the smallpox from the Europeans, that's absolutely where it's coming from, then everybody gets it. And so the entire town, the entire village is wiped out all at once. Continue on with strong notes now. In North America, the epidemiology is different. Instead, it arrives in waves. In other words, the Europeans will be on the East Coast. 90% of all those Native Americans on the East Coast, they'll die of disease. Then the Europeans, the English primarily, but Germans and others as well, then we'll get to the Appalachians. Then 90% of all the Native Americans, the Appalachians, they'll all get wiped out by disease. But then the Americans, the Europeans and the Americans later on will go into the Ohio River Valley, and 90% of them will be wiped out by disease. Then, all the way out into the mid-1800s, the Americans, the white man, will cross the Mississippi, And that's when they are all wiped out by this disease. So in North America, the disease arrives in waves because all these settlements are so widely dispersed. By contrast, in the Aztec and the Inca Empire, you have large cities, urban environments, and those populations are wiped out down to an individual and almost all at once. People get in these cities and they all die. But the big killer is not the Spanish going out there and murdering all these Native Americans, it's disease. Because the Spanish, as it turns out, as time went on, the Spanish needed the Native Americans. So the Spanish needed the Native Americans. They are the ones that are going to be doing all of the work. There's not enough Spanish there to do all the things necessary to run these enormous civilizations. There's just not enough Spanish there. Not enough Spanish are coming over from Europe. Many people in Spain are going to be ordered to remain in Spain by the kings so they can commit to these wars. The Spanish have to have a huge army. Jeffrey Parker wrote a book on this, The Army of Flanders and the Spanish Road. And in it, he took this all completely apart, scrutinized this in excruciating detail, and he talked a lot about the money. And so he says, yeah, the money's what drove all this, and the money was coming from the New World. But the manpower was coming from Spain, and so the Spanish had to stay there in Spain. So in the New World, in turn, the Spanish needed the Native Americans to work the land. And this leads us to these writs of encomienda. You see these two examples that I have. Both of these were written by the viceroys here in the New World. The one on the left, this is from the viceroy of Peru. You can see the phrase Peru is down there. And on the right, it's from the viceroy in Cuba. So there they have the coat of arms. They have all these different symbols all over them, and it's saying, it explains what's going on here. So a writ of encomienda. This gives certain Spanish control over a huge tract of land, along with all the Native Americans in that land. They're saying, okay, you're the governor, not necessarily the governor, but you're the controller of all this vast treasure of land. And it'll all be written in there where all the land is at. And you control all the people that are in it. And the idea is that the Spanish would trade protection and exposure to the Christian faith to the Native Americans. And in return, the Native Americans would work for the Spanish. Well, within about a generation, this just turns into serfdom. It just turns into old-fashioned serfdom. The people have to work the land. They're never going to rise above that. The Spanish are going to come along and take everything in taxation. They're going to drive the Native Americans into what's called corvée labor, C-O-R-V-E, with a little apostrophe mark above it. And so corvée labor means that you work for the state for a certain period of time. Well, these holders of these encomiendas are just going to say, yeah, your corvée labor runs 300 days a year, and you get the 65 for yourself. And so the kind of that image in the middle, again, it dates from the time they've got these Native Americans out there working the land. When the land is harvested, the Spanish are going to come in and take it, and they're going to sell it. They're going to take all the money. So this encomienda thing is just nothing but serfdom. The Native Americans are they're just basically slaves. They're working the land, and that's why the Spanish need them. They're working the gold mines. That's why the Spanish need them. They're doing all of the, food production and everything else. That's why the Spanish need them. So did the Spanish go out there and murder all these Native Americans? In those previous slides, I said no. Violence did happen. That's an absolute documented fact. But it's not systematized genocide the way the Dutch are portraying it. Again, don't forget that because you're going to need that later on. So, encomienda labor, the Spanish need the Aztecs, they need the Inca, they need all of these allied tribes. None of this is good. I submit to your candor that every historian that writes about this suggests that the Spanish American with the Native Americans, the Spanish interaction with the Native Americans, is a net negative. Most will die of disease, but the survivors did not have it good either. All right, well, I've discussed all I'm really going to discuss now about the Spanish and their interaction with the Native Americans. It's characterized by trade's increase. Christopher Columbus, he tried that. Cortez tried trade's increase as well, but then switched to plunder and glory. The kings of Spain said, listen, we've got to try and convert these people to Christianity. Pizarro tried that, 3 minutes. It's horrifying. So what characterized the Spanish interaction with Native Americans most? Plunder and glory. Plunder and glory. So with that, let's transition and start talking about a few other issues. This is a little bit of housekeeping, but you need to know what's really going on. But we're going to transition to what the French are up to. So this is just a lead-in slide, very briefly. The French colonial experience, our thesis, the next major element of this, our thesis is going to be that the French are going to exhibit a mutually beneficial relationship with the Native Americans. In other words, in the macro, the Europeans, primarily the Spanish, the French, and the English, will have 3 different ways, mechanisms of dealing with the Native Americans. For the Spanish, net negative, we just talked about that. For the French, it's going to be a mutually beneficial relationship. That's the next major element, the French. The next couple of slides, a word on travel, how we're going to get around. Again, this is background information. Minimal notes here, but don't forget it either. Don't skip these slides. We will talk a little bit about pirates and buccaneers. That should be fun. It has nothing to do with Johnny Depp, but it should be a good time. Then we'll talk about the French. I'll have a few phrases that you guys kind of need to know that's going to be helpful to you. Then we'll talk about the French explorers and the French colonial methodology, how they actually went about dealing with the Native Americans. Your readings, chapter 1, 2, and 3. A little bit of a sidebar here. Most textbooks do not cover what I've covered when we talk about American history 1301. They want to start with the English in 1607 and just go through to the Civil War because they're only talking about American history, absolutely American history. They're going to limit themselves. But these other issues cannot be ignored. So I'm putting forth a little bit of extra time and effort, giving you more background information, talking about the Spanish and what's going on, and talking about the French. So with that in mind, let's talk about how we're going to travel around back in the 14, 15, and 16, 1700s. You'll notice that I have it there in bold. The ocean is a highway, not a barrier. For many years, most historians explain this as the ocean is a highway and a barrier, but it's not. You'll excuse me for misspelling highway. I just caught that. My goodness me. Well, we're just going to go on. All right. So here we go. The ocean is a highway, not a barrier. In other words, when we get rid of this idea that it's a barrier, I've studied this for years and years and years. Evidently not my spelling, but certainly the ideas. And I can't think of a single thing that was prevented. Disease went across, ideas went across. Some people talk about the Columbian Exchange. This is animals and fruits and vegetables that came from the New World, and animals and fruits and vegetables that came from the Old World. In other words, a Roman pizza probably existed, some form of bread with food on it. Pretty straightforward deal. I'm talking about this in 2023. It turns out that in some archaeological finds in Herculaneum, they found a picture of what is thought to be a sort of a pizza. Yeah, but they didn't have tomatoes. That's New World. They didn't have peppers, like green peppers or jalapenos. That's New World. That hadn't been invented. That hadn't been transmitted to the Old World yet. In the New World, no horses, no pigs, no cattle. When the Spanish first saw buffalo, they knew the word buffalo, which is Italian, but they insisted on calling buffalo vaca, which is cow. They didn't know what else to call them. But a domesticated cow, that has to come from the Old World. Pigs, they have to come from the Old World. There's this exchange. And so the ocean is a highway, not a barrier. Drilling down a little bit, I have some pictures of ships up there, and this is what we're really talking about. The large ship over there called a galleon. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a large vessel. It's going to carry between 8 and 1,200 tons of goods. These are large sailing ships. And I want you guys to think of that, a galleon, as like a big rig, a big tractor trailer, an 18-wheeler of its age. Next to that is a caravel, and then below there in the lower left is a cog. These are just different types of sailing ships. And caravels and cogs, they must have been thousands of them. Thousands and thousands. They're at sea all the time, traveling back and forth with all sorts of goods. There's many in harbors, loading and unloading. Many more being built. And so that illustration, Lisbon Harbor in 1572, you can see that there's dozens and dozens of ships in Lisbon Harbor in the Tagus, on the Tagus River. And so every major port city, Ostend and Dunkirk, London is a port city, Bristol, Portsmouth, they were teeming with ships of this nature. Venice, just a great big giant archipelago with a huge harbor, thousands and thousands of ships there. Constantinople, no less, thousands of ships. And so the ocean is a highway, not a barrier. If you need to go someplace, you preferred to travel by sea. Going by road, that's ridiculous. The roads were like non-existent. The Roman roads had deteriorated. I've walked on many a Roman road in Germany. They're all over the place. But nobody built a Roman-like road for a long, long time. Most of these roads in Europe were just dirt trails. Nobody took a wagon anywhere. You had to take mule trains all over Europe. They're dangerous. So if you could go by sea, that's how you traveled. That's how you traveled. So when we talk about people in the 1500s wanting to travel by sea, it's just commonplace. It's just ordinary. That's how you did it. Nobody thought anything about it. So the ocean is a highway, not a barrier. That's the first big idea I want you guys to get. And I'm going to repeat that time and time and time again as we go through this course. Well, what else is going on here in terms of background information that you might need to know? Let's talk about pirates and buccaneers. So, pirates and buccaneers, the Brotherhood of the Coast, sea dogs. What a story. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this has nothing whatsoever to do with Johnny Depp chasing Keira Knightley across the TV screen there. It's not a movie. These are the actual pirates that did exist back in those days. Strong note here. You're going to need this later on. Navies, as we understand that, as a military arm of the state. The state exists, it has an army, it has a navy. Navies sort of existed, but they're extremely ad hoc. In other words, as an arm of the state, you just get a bunch of ships together, the king or the queen declares that to be her or his navy. They're the navy for a short period of time, and then when the emergency is over with, when the war is over, they're dispersed. The ships are basically rented. A navy, as you and I would understand it, does not emerge until the mid-1600s and 1700s. But in the time frame we're talking about, the 1400s and 1500s, strong note here. As soon as any one of these ships, even if they are rented or owned by the state, as soon as they left European waters, they turned buccaneer. They were pirates. A good example of that, Admiral Michael Zunderreuter. De Ruyter was a pirate and a buccaneer. If you go to Holland today, he is celebrated as this brilliant admiral and the founder of the Dutch Navy and instrumental in getting Dutch sea power out there. It's really the high point of the Dutch experience at sea. But as soon as he was out of European or Dutch waters, he was a pirate. I'm telling you, a buccaneer. Now, there are nuances here. The English and the Dutch usually teamed up. Now, there was the First, Second, and Third Dutch Wars, but they were of short duration, and they were just settling some differences. Most of the time, through most of the history that we're talking about right now, 14, 15, 1600s, 1700s, the Dutch and the English usually teamed up. They were co-religionists. Their politics and their trade were intertwined, and they teamed up. Usually their target was the Spanish, sometimes the French, but usually the Spanish in the time frame we're talking about. Occasionally some of the Italian states, maybe Venice. The Spanish, they had enemies everywhere. Their ships were known to be loaded with gold, and so anybody that could would take a Spanish ship, kill everybody on board, steal everything they could steal, and sink the ship if they couldn't, use it. So let's take a look at an actual pirate, one of the most horrifying individuals known, because you guys know you got to have a pirate story in here somewhere. Jean-Francois d'Aulnois. Now, Aulnois there was something wrong with him, okay? He was a psychopath, and everybody said so. He's French. So when we think of piracy, we don't think of the French, but they were pirates and buccaneers just as bad as anybody else. Well, Aulnois was a murderer. Very famously, he dressed in red, had a big flamboyant hat. He's not using that right in this particular illustration that you see there in the middle of the bottom row. The story goes that he was known throughout the Caribbean as this horrible, horrible monster who would kill everybody. Again, he was deranged. Something was wrong with him. But he was successful. Well, there I was as a historian in a Dutch museum in Leiden at the archives there, and I ran across this letter. I was looking for something else and found that, and that's the way it always works. And this letter described what had happened. This Dutch captain had washed up on some Caribbean island and was scared half to death that the natives were going to eat him. So he traded all of his belt buckles and all of his shoe buckles and all of his buttons. He said, don't eat me, don't eat me. And they were like, no, we're not going to eat you. Everything's cool. So we're sitting around the campfire. This Dutch captain wrote this all in the letter, and I was reading it. They were sitting around the campfire, and these Native Americans started explaining through sign language, hey, we saw another white guy like you, but he was a monster. And the more they talked, the more this Dutch captain came to realize they were talking about this Aulnois character. And they said, yeah, he'd washed up on the beach as well. And we took him in and tried to, like, help him out, and, but he turned out to be a monster. So it was so bad that they tied him to a tree and killed him. They ripped his heart out. Well, and then they ate him. Now, cannibalism, ladies and gentlemen, is usually a ritual. The person that you're eating is somebody that you have revered, you have respected. They have died, and you're going to take a little snippet off of them and eat it, and then you'll contain part of that person. But the Native Americans were telling this Dutch captain, and I was reading the letter. And they told him, yeah, we didn't eat him because we revered him. We ate him so we could crap him out. They turned him into feces. How bad does a human being have to be, that they're going to digest this guy? And, there he is. The story goes that whatever's left, all the bones, they burn that into ash and then scatter the ashes around. So there'll be nothing left of this guy. What a horrible person he must have been. Analysis. Strong note here. By the way, there's 1,000,001 pirate stories. Oh my God, there's whole books written on them, and each story is crazier than the last one. But analysis. In the macro, what's really going on here, ladies and gentlemen, these pirates are going into the Caribbean. They're attacking the Spanish. They're bringing back a vast treasure of gold and silver. And it transmits a singular message, which is what I really want you to write down. That the New World is absolutely paved with gold and silver. All you got to do is knock the Spanish on the head and take it from them. Because they had knocked the Native Americans on the head and took their gold and silver. You can get rich, but the New World is absolutely paved with gold and silver. Real quickly, another little pirate story. So Francis Drake, he had been a very famous part of the British Navy as it then existed in the time of Elizabeth. We're talking about the 1580's. He had circumnavigated the world. He was the second one to do it. Magellan was first. He was second. And he went on another expedition into South America, Central America. And, everybody wanted to be in on it. I have a little statistic for you. In his first voyage, he brought back all this gold and silver, and it was a 15,000% increase on the investors in his voyage. He went to a bunch of people and said, hey, give me some money. I'll get a ship together. We'll go down there and go buccaneering. I'll come back and you'll get a cut. And then a 15,000% return on their investment, including the Queen, Elizabeth. She made enough money on that deal to start building more ships, to get another navy going, to build a navy based on this buccaneering and pirating. So all of these ships are coming back to the New World. Going to the New World, coming back to the Old World, and they're bringing a vast treasure of money with them. Francis Drake attacked another town, Cartagena. He had a whole bunch of guys with him. These ships have to have rocks and ballast in the bottom of the hull so that they stay upright in a wind. The richness of the hull meant that they had to take all the rocks and ballast stones out of the bottom of the ship and replace it with huge, giant treasure chests of gold and silver. The ships got overloaded and were so low to the ground, so low to the water, the captains went to Drake and said, hey, we've got our food, our water, our crew, our cannons and cannonballs and stuff, and now we've loaded up all this gold. We can't load up anymore, we'll sink. And so they had to leave a big giant pile of gold and silver on the beach and sail off because they didn't have any cargo space anymore. That must have made a lot of people cry. But that's the kind of wealth we're talking about. These guys get back to the old world, and the message is clear. Go to the new world, you're going to make out like a bandit. The 1715 fleet, one of the last of the major treasure fleets, went down in a hurricane. It is estimated that $11 billion in gold went down. Most of it is still in the water. A couple of these ships have been found, and the divers go down there all the time, and they bring up gold and silver, chains, riches beyond the dreams of avarice. It's amazing. Well, I could go on about pirates and buccaneers for a long time, but we do have to talk about the French. Very quickly on this slide, ladies and gentlemen, you can pause this if you want and write all this down, but these are some phrases you're going to need. I'll use these phrases again and again and again as we talk about the French. Coureur de bois. Coureur de bois means messenger of the forest, messenger of the wood. Circa, you can say that C dot, that stands for the phrase circa. It's Roman Latin. It means in the area of. 1600, 1760. They're also known as, AKA, also known as voyageurs. And these are individual French explorers, traders, who go into French-controlled North America and establish close relationships with the Native Americans. Sachem, not Sachem, Sachem. Dr. Collins, my old professor, he said it that way, so I say it that way. And these are leaders of large tribes. It's associated with North America, not so much the Aztecs or the Inca. But in North America, they refer to themselves as Sachems, if they're the leader of any big tribe. I'm talking about, when we talk about a Sachem, I want you guys to be thinking of many tens of thousands of people under the leadership of a single individual. Tyendinaga, Pontiac, all these other people that we're going to be talking about. They are great Sachems. Here's a French phrase for you, pays d'une haute. Pays d'une haute means the area in between, or the area that's on the plateau, the area above, the high ground. But it means, in translation, it really means that area all around the Great Lakes where the French concluded all their alliances in these early years. So roughly, and I'll have maps up there later on, roughly from the Ohio River up to Hudson Bay, and from the Mississippi to the Atlantic. Pays d'une haute, from the Ohio River up to Hudson Bay. I have a map later on. And from the Mississippi River east to the Atlantic Ocean. This includes all the Great Lakes. So again, if you want to write all this down, I do want you to take good notes, but just pause the slide because I do want to move on and start talking about the French explorers. Here are the French in North America. So let me start kind of at the start. The French got a slow start in exploration. They are next in line, but the French got a slow start in exploration. Because back in France, there was one civil war after another, after another, after another, 11 separate civil wars based on religion. There was the St. Bartholomew Days massacre. Many thousands were killed in Paris over this sort of thing. One civil war after another, after another, after another, because of religion. But after a while, France became more and more thoroughly Catholic, and so the civil wars went away. The French Protestants, the Huguenots, they either moved to the New World, or they moved to the Dutch Republic, or they moved to England. Lots and lots of them fled to England. So with that in mind, we have the French kind of late in the exploration game, mid 1500s to mid 1600s, 1700s, in through there. When we look at the explorers that I'm going to give you as examples, that's exactly what's going on. Jacques Cartier, early on, take a look at the dates. So Jacques Cartier, here we are in the 1500s, mid-1500s. He's finally going to leave France and go straight immediately across the Atlantic. So just sail straight west. And he's going to land, he's going to make landfall somewhere we think around Virginia. Maybe a little bit farther north, but probably somewhere in Virginia. And he's going to bounce with his ship, go out to sea, go a little bit farther north, then go back to the west, bump into North America again, and then sail out and just bump along the coast, heading north. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're sitting down for this. He was still looking for a sea route north around America to get to China. That's what was really motivating him. Jacques Cartier is looking for a way around North America to get to China. We're still trying to get to China. We all know that there's not a way to do that. That route is difficult even today for navigation. Just nobody can do it. Samuel de Champlain, as you can see, he's kind of middle of this period that the French are going to be active in North America. He's in the early 1600s. Champlain is thought of as the father of Canada. He's going to discover the St. Lawrence Seaway and move inland. Strong note here. Samuel Champlain was a religious man, but he was more of an educator than anything else. He started working very hard to try to learn the Native American languages. He used interpreters. He used his skill sets to try and figure out the Native American language and work with them. He discovered some of the Great Lakes, found Quebec. He'll go back and forth several times. The next guy is in the lower left. And what a name. René Robert de Chevalier Sard de la Salle. There we go. I managed to butcher it up just a little bit. René Robert Chevalier Sard de la Salle. So known to history as La Salle. La Salle is fine. La Salle was an amazing character. Determined, a little bit hard to get along with, but determined and very resourceful. Again, we're talking about the late 1600s, so he goes to New France, pushes inland, goes by canoe, bateau as they called them, across the Great Lakes, gets to the west coast of Lake Superior. He portages across. That means you unload these big bateaux, and you put your supplies aside, then you pick up the boat, get it out of the water, and then you carry it to a stream or a river. Go back and get your supplies, put it back on the boat, and then move on. Well, so he was able to do that and get into the northern reaches of the Mississippi and Missouri River. And he went all the way down river, paddling in these big giant canoes, these bateaux. Got down to, ladies and gentlemen, got all the way down to Lake Pontchartrain. And he very famously kind of, tasted the water. And he said, hey, it's brackish. We hit the sea. So then, believe it or not, he turned these canoes around, these bateaux, and paddled all the way back up to modern-day Chicago, somewhere right around Chicago, paddling against the stream. Portaged back across into Lake Superior and paddled in these bateaux, these canoes, all the way back to Quebec. Took ship back to France, explained to everybody what he'd done. This took several years. And he convinced the King of Spain to let him go back to the New World, go into the Gulf of Mexico, and put a fort or found a city at the mouth of this giant river, the Mississippi. Because if you have a giant fort at the mouth of a river, then you control the entire river. So sure, they said, yeah, do that. The story goes that he overshot and landed in Texas, somewhere down around Beaumont. There he was fighting with his men. Supplies were low. He got murdered. The men decided they could not go back to France because they'd murdered their leader. The expedition broke up. This is true. One of the men was actually captured by the Kiowa. They sold him to the Yaquis, who are northern Aztecs. The Yaquis sold him to some of the other Aztecs, and finally wound up in Mexico City, controlled by the Spanish. So can you imagine one of these sailors, one of these French sailors, showing up in Mexico City, and the Spanish were like, who are you? What are you doing here? That guy had a story to tell. They sent him back to France. But La Salle was an amazing explorer. Last but not least, my spelling is bad and my English is too. Marquis Joseph Louis de Saint-Véran de Montcalm, known as Montcalm. Now, Montcalm is one of these last leaders of the French in North America. He's going to be killed in action. We will run into him again later on at the Battle of Quebec. So please make a strong note on him. He's going to be one of the last of these important French leaders in what will become Canada. Strong note here. Make a strong note here. The Dutch propaganda had an impact on the French. And they were convinced that the Dutch propaganda that we talked about before was actually true. And the various kings and queens of France put out a message. They made a law. They made a decree. Strong note now, if any of these explorers meet these Native Americans who say that they are the leader of a great people, you must treat them that way. And if you make a contract or a deal or a treaty with them, you must respect that treaty. You must respect that deal as though it were made with any other European country. I'll say it again. The kings and queens of France had seen what the Spanish were doing, at least what the Dutch said. They thought that was horrible. And they said to all of their explorers, if you go to the New World and you interact with these Native Americans and they say they're a leader of a great people, then you have to treat them that way. If you make a deal or a business exchange, you have to honor that treaty, that business exchange. You have to honor that as though you had done it with any other European country. So, from the start, the French had a positive relationship with the Native Americans. Now, this is in complete contrast with what the Spanish are up to, and it will be different than what the English are up to later on. The French mechanism for dealing with the Native Americans is different from the Spanish, different from the English. It is net positive. So with that in mind, as good old Dr. Buchanan used to say, let's put some meat on them bones. French colonialism, about 1550 to 1763. Now, 1550, a vague date there, because the French exploration takes a long time. But it ends in 1763 for sure, and we will talk about that later on. That's part of the French and Indian Wars, and we will get to that. So what characterizes the French interaction with the Native Americans is a mutually beneficial relationship. I have it there bold and underlined. To reiterate, the Europeans, primarily the Spanish, the French, and the English, had different ways, different mechanisms for dealing with the Native Americans. For the Spanish, trades increase, spread the word of God, plunder and glory. of which plunder and glory was the most influential mechanism. For the French, what characterized the French relationship with the Native Americans is a mutually beneficial relationship based on the fur trade. This is a mutually beneficial relationship. Both sides won. And as it turns out, both sides felt like they were taking advantage of the other guys. All right. So let's put some meat on them bones. Here we go. Very early on, the French realized that the North American Native Americans did not have gold and silver like the Inca and the Aztec. But they did have something that the Europeans wanted very, very badly, and that is easy access to these fur-bearing animals. Now, for that, we need to go back to Europe. We're back in Europe now. And wearing of fur, this was absolutely limited to the elite, the upper class. And that had gone on for many, many years. The restriction is called a sumptuary law, and most of the European countries had sumptuary laws. But the rich, wealthy elite, they wanted a whole lot of fur, not a little bit, but a lot. So many of these fur-bearing animals had been hunted out. We're not going to get a whole lot of trade in fur from Siberia for another 200 years. Most of these animals have been hunted out in Europe. So then along come these French traders, and they see that the Native Americans in Canada, we're back in Canada now, back in North America, the pasty and all it, they have fur-bearing animals all over the place. Those luxurious. Some of these animals nobody had ever seen before in Europe. You can see some examples here. There's a variety of raccoons. There's various Arctic animals, especially Arctic fox. An Arctic fox, if you ever see one, on some nature show or whatever, it's like a big giant cotton ball. And the fur is stark, startling white. There's some pelts right there. Unpleasant photographs, I know, but this is what we're talking about. Well, back in Europe, the sumptuary laws were becoming more and more weak, and therefore the rich upper class, the rich middle classes that existed, they could buy furs as well. So there was an enormous market for fur back in Europe. And you can make a lot of money on that. In practical application, you're back in America, you talk to one of these Native Americans and say, hey, bring me some fur. They're like, okay. And fur will ship very easily. It's already preserved. It's tanned. So you throw a bunch of fur into the bottom of a barrel, put in some wood chips to keep it dry, another layer of fur, another layer of wood chips, another layer of fur, another layer of wood chips, bung up this barrel, seal it all up, send it back to France. And in France, some merchant's going to open that barrel up and say, I've got millions of dollars here. This is worth millions. So back in America, what then are the French trading? What are the French giving up? Now, these are called trade goods. Please write that down. Trade goods. And I have a list for you, and it's illustrated right there. Trade goods. Don't forget this list, ladies and gentlemen. Strong note here. Don't forget it. You will need this later. Trade goods. Iron pots and pans. Knives and hatchets. Brightly colored cloth. Brightly colored beads. And that little picture in the middle there, musket, shot, and powder. Musket, shot, and powder must go together. You can't have one without the others. Our list again. Iron pots and pans. Knives and hatchets. Brightly colored cloth. Brightly colored beads. And musket, shot, and powder. Now, very briefly, let's go over this for a second. An iron pot and pan, the utility is obvious. But there's something more that I want you guys to know about. Okay, so the Native Americans, they have communities. We've talked about that. But every so often, they have to like move their community because they don't know anything about, toilet sanitation. They don't know anything about that yet. How you deal with, you live in one spot for a while, it's going to get nasty. Well, the iron pots and pans, take a look at that picture there. Those are actual French trade goods, archaeological finds. They're really super heavy. So when you get ready, when the Native Americans would get ready to leave their village and go set up another village someplace else, they would simply abandon that stuff, put it underneath a big rock, cover it up with a bunch of brush and woods, kind of hide it maybe a little bit, and then move on. When they arrived at their new location, they would contact the French and say, hey, we need more iron pots and pans. And what would the French say? Sure, give me some furs. All right. Hold my beer. I'll be back in a minute. A year or two or three would go by. The Native Americans got to move again. Again, they're going to need more pots and pans. They move a third or a fourth time. They need more pots and pans. They finally get back to the first location, and all those iron pots and pans have rusted away. So there's a very constant, steady need for more iron pots and pans. Knives and hatchets, I don't think I have to explain the utility of knives and hatchets out on the frontier. Remember that the Native Americans did not have a whole lot of iron work. They didn't have steel works. Brightly colored cloth, I use that specific illustration. Those are Hudson Bay trade blankets. And the more and better fur that you brought into the Courrier de Bois, the better blanket you got. Larger, more colors, worth more. Some are tiny little things that are just no more than just a little bitty, a tablecloth. Some that you can see partly there, a blanket with a whole lot of stripes on it, a white blanket with a lot of stripes. That was a big giant blanket and many, many colors. The Native Americans would take that and then turn it into an overcoat. Well, a white overcoat in the winter, excellent camouflage, excellent camouflage. Sidebar, Hudson Bay blankets like that are still available. Bring your credit card. A large Hudson Bay blanket, $600, $700, $800. They're expensive, but they're made exactly the same way that they've been made for the last 300 years. Brightly colored beads, the Native Americans had used beads for years and years and years. You take a little mussel shell, you take a little seashell, you drill a hole in it, that's the controlling interest, string it on a bunch of beads, string the beads together, and you have what's called wampum. And this is essentially money, but they're also symbolic belts, belts for peace, belts that symbolize war. Musket shot and powder, again, I can't overemphasize the importance of that, and I probably don't have to explain why musket shot and powder is like a really interesting tool to the Native Americans. They could see the utility of it. So again, in practical terms, the Courrier de Bois show up with some trade goods that you see here, and they say to the Native Americans, bring me a bunch of fur. And what do the Native Americans say? Okay, sure, be right back. They make the trade, and what do the French say? These fools, I give them pots and pans and some glass beads, and look what I got. This stuff's worth thousands and thousands back in Europe. And what do the Native Americans say? These fools, look at this beautiful blanket. Look at all these beads. Look at all this stuff. Beads are essentially money, cash. So both sides felt like they were playing the other side for a fool. But this kept the peace. Over time, ladies and gentlemen, strong note now, this will turn into a military relationship. This will turn into a military relationship. Mostly to resist the English. Now, one last sociological issue I want to talk about here on this slide. It's not on there, so you have to make strong notes here. Again, Richard White, Settling with the Indians, he talks about this a lot in his book. It's a gigantic book. You really should read this. And he talks about how over time, both sides would alter their society to preserve the peace. Very quick example. Let's say some of these coureurs de bois were out among the Native Americans, and one of them committed a murder. Or, probably more accurately, one of the coureurs de bois was murdered. And the French found out about this. So the French would go to the Native Americans and say, listen, we want the guy who did this, who murdered our coureur de bois. And the Native Americans would say, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to hang him up. Strong note now. Among the Native Americans, there is no death penalty. A death penalty among the Native Americans would simply start a blood feud. Instead, the Native Americans, when there was some terrible transgression like a murder, they would cover it up. Not cover up the murder, not defraud anybody. They would cover up the price with gifts. In other words, one Native American murders another. The other guy's family, the victim's family, goes and says, hey, killed our guy. All right, here's all of the things that we're going to give you as presents, as a blood price, to make it go away in order to preserve the peace, because war is expensive. But among the French, it's eye for an eye. You killed, you must die. That sort of thing. This is Roman law. It goes back thousands of years. So in practical terms, both sides learned to give up a little bit. The Native Americans learned to give the murderer up to the French. The French would then have a trial, presumably pronounce the death sentence, and rather than hanging the murderer, they would wait for the Native Americans to give them gifts, usually a bunch of fur. And then the French would say, okay, here's your guy back. This preserves the peace. Again, this is a mutually beneficial relationship. Both sides want to keep that up. They don't want a war. So over time, both sides will alter their cultures to fit into this relationship, to enhance this relationship, to preserve the peace. So when we talk about the French, in large terms, in broad terms, it is a positive relationship, much in contrast to what the Spanish are doing and what the English will do later on. So we're very nearly there, ladies and gentlemen. 2 more slides. Now, this is the big map. I told you I would present you with a map. This is a contemporary map from the time, and it's basically the Great Lakes region. You can see that some of the lakes are either spurious or way out of proportion. In other words, Lake Huron is not that big. Lake Erie is a lot smaller. Lake Superior, it doesn't look like that at all. Those big giant islands out there, they do not exist. But that is this Paysian hot region, this land in between. I misspoke just a minute ago. Richard White's book is The Middle Ground. That's what it's called, The Middle Ground. Excellent book, well-researched. Richard White did a great job there, and most of the material that I'm giving you in this part of our discussion is come from The Middle Ground by Richard White. If you want to read a book about this sort of thing that really outlines the Native American experience with the French in North America at the time, that's the one. So I have there some of these other explorers. De Champlain is there, the father of New France, discovered Lake Champlain, Lake Huron. Marquette and Joliet, they explored the upper Mississippi in 1673. La Salle, he's going to go down there in 1682. You saw that. We talked about that earlier. And so this is that area, that Paysian hot region, that the French are going to be very, very influential in. So with that in mind, let's have some conclusions. In conclusion on this presentation, and I want to express my appreciation. I'm looking at the clock on this thing. It's run 2 hours and a half. Thank you very much for sticking with me. We went over this very carefully. The Native Americans in the New World were highly sophisticated. They had everything that we associate with civilization except an easily transmittable form of writing. They had writing, but it wasn't simple. The Europeans, primarily the Spanish, the French, and the English, had different ways of interacting with the Native Americans. We went over the Spanish and the French here. Again, if you're taking this for a course, 1301, don't depend upon your text. You're going to have to depend almost entirely on this presentation. For the Spanish, Cortez in Mexico, the Pizarro brothers in South America, spread the word of God, plunder and glory, trades increase. And of those, plunder and glory was the most influential element of their interaction. We talked about the role of sea travel. The ocean's a highway, not a barrier. However I spell it, it's a highway, not a barrier. And pirates. It's not that they're out there stealing and murdering and having a great time, drinking a lot of rum. They did do that. But they are transmitting this message back to Europe that gold is everywhere. All you got to do there is go there, knock somebody on the head, and take their gold and silver. We talked about the French just now. Mutually beneficial relationship based on the fur trade. Trade goods, don't forget that list. Make sure you can find that list. You will need that list later on. Our next presentation, I'll talk about the English. That begins in 1607. So thank you very much for your time and your patience. I'll have this posted as soon as I can. Thank you very much.